All right, hello everyone. I want to do a run through and a recap of the snowstorm we had over the weekend. Always like to do these a few days after the event, just to go over the good, the bad, and the ugly of how the forecast panned out, what went right, what went wrong, why you may have gotten more or less snow than what was forecast, things like that. So let's take a look. So here are the observations that we had across the area. This takes into account CoCoRaHS, Co-op, and all those observations like that. Overall, we had our highest snow was expected to be across kind of the northern Midlands and PD, where anywhere between 6 to 10 inches fell across portions of Lancaster and Chesterfield County, with the highest we had up in Indian Land of 9 inches. Totals decreased as you move to the southeast along I-20 and towards 77, generally between 3 to 5 inches in those areas. Had a relative minimum from basically Columbia towards Aiken, down into Barnwell and Bamberg counties, where between 1 to 4 inches roughly fell in those areas. And then we increased again as you moved into Augusta, west along I-20, where we had about 3 to 5 inches fell. Overall, this was the most snow for the Augusta area since 2010, the most snow for Columbia since 2011, and for Lancaster and Chesterfield, the most snow since 2004. So ended up being still a historic event, even though the totals didn't really work out in a few areas like we expected, but we'll get into that a little bit more. If you look just generally at the bigger picture across all of eastern Georgia and into North Carolina, really those highest totals were up in Charlotte, where they really got hammered, especially in the morning on Saturday morning. And then another big band occurred over in extreme northeastern South Carolina and into North Carolina, where some of those bands from the coastal low ended up putting up over a foot of snow. So the relative min across the area was down from basically Orangeburg down to the coast. And this was kind of the general picture that ended up playing out. We had a snow squall band that developed on the western flank of those upper lows that were developing that pushed down into portions of the CSRA, including Thompson and Martinez, and just barely clipped Augusta. But we did see some basically snow squall conditions in those areas with less than quarter-mile visibility and over 1 inch an hour rates for a period of time. So take a look at the forecast verification here. This is what we were forecasting basically 24 hours out. We had kind of a 4 to 7 range for Columbia, 5 to 8 as you move north into Fairfield, and Kershaw counties, and then kind of a 5 to 10 across the northern Midlands. So just eyeballing this from what we saw in the last couple slides, underperformed a bit across Columbia. And then everywhere else tended to do pretty well. It was kind of from Columbia down through Orangeburg that didn't get as much snow as forecast, but we'll talk about that. Take a look at the probability from 36 hours out of over 6 inches of snow. We ended up getting over 6 inches of snow across all of Lancaster and Chesterfield counties and down into portions of northern Kershaw. But yeah, these probabilities, the 71% chance means there's a 29% chance it doesn't happen. So, it's always hard to message probabilities, but obviously we had some pretty good confidence that Columbia could see that much. It didn't work out that way, but it's how the forecast goes sometimes. As you move down towards Augusta, we didn't have any 6-inch reports in our areas of eastern Georgia, but we did get pretty close. Had a several 5-inch snowfall amounts. So these probabilities kind of message that hazard, I think, pretty well in the Augusta area and then up in the Lancaster and Chesterfield area. This was our forecast from Saturday morning, so basically just before the event started. Still, we're forecasting kind of 3 to 5 inches down in Augusta, and that 5 to 8 range for Columbia. And then we were thinking those higher amounts were going to unfold across the northern Midlands and PD, which ended up happening in this case, where we had basically 8 to 10 inches across Lancaster and Chesterfield counties. So overall, the forecast grade, how I would grade myself for forecasting this event, because I was working a lot of it. Overall, it was a pretty good forecast across the northern Midlands. They kind of fell in a little bit different window than we expected. It was a very long duration snow event. It ended up snowing for like 15 hours, just with not very heavy rates for the most of that. We had a kind of slight overperform, I would say, in eastern Georgia. Didn't expect to see as many, pushing 6-inch snowfall amounts there. But overall, the forecast worked out pretty well. And then underperform, or, the poorer area of the forecast would have been kind of the central to western Midlands, from basically starting in Columbia and moving down I-26 into the southern Midlands. So the good and the bad, I would say impacts verified well across the whole area, even those that didn't get as much snow. The interstates, secondary roads were a complete mess. both Saturday evening and especially into Sunday morning. The PD, Northern Midlands, especially Chesterfield and Lancaster, verified well. And then the Western CSRA also, we were forecasting that kind of 1 to 3 hour window with those heavy rates coming through and bringing most of the snow for the CSRA and Western Augusta areas in a relatively short period of time, and that did work out pretty well. The bad, the initial snowfall rates, especially Saturday morning into the early afternoon across the Midlands, were just paltry. They didn't really do much at all. They were seeing maybe 1/10 of an inch an hour. Even though it snowed all morning, it just didn't really accumulate. Even though we had sub-freezing temperatures, we were in kind of the upper 20s the whole morning. And then this in general led to those lower totals across the Columbia metro area, southeastward into Aiken County. So what happened in the Midlands that we didn't see as much snow as forecast? Basically, the models just didn't do very well and had a hard time translating why they didn't do very well. The bottom of the model guidance for liquid QPF that fell at CAE was around 2/10 of liquid. So if you were assuming a 10-to-1 ratio, that would be roughly 2 inches of snow. Only 1,700ths fell at CAE. We did have those higher ratios, so we got about 3 inches of snow out of that. But this liquid amount was below anything that the models had. So generally, forecasts get tough when the models are just completely wrong. They did well across the Northern Midlands and did well across Augusta, but they just didn't do very well across the Midlands. And I'll talk a little bit as to why that happened, but right here. So basically, we had very shallow moisture, so we needed strong, shallow forcing, which is always a tricky thing for models to forecast because you're talking about temperature advection and forcing at a very low level that is a little bit more sensitive to errors in model guidance and things like that. So this shallow forcing generally rode north of where the model guidance had it. So this was the forecast from the night before, had that stronger temperature advection extending down into Columbia and even into the southern Midlands a little bit. This ended up being about 25 to 50 miles north up over Charlotte and especially north of Charlotte. So this was kind of the first thing that ended up going a little bit wrong with the forecast for the Midlands at least. So yes, this led to the stronger warm advection and frontogenesis to the north. And then we had basically a convergence jet on the backside of the low that came across and went basically straight over the Columbia metro area that caused that snow squall and heavy periods of snow for eastern Georgia and into Augusta. So this is what ended up happening. This red shading is the temperature advection. It's not the same shading as the previous forecast, but effectively the strongest temperature advection went north of I-20, especially into northern South Carolina and into southern North Carolina. And then this is the 700 millibar plot here with that low basically going directly overhead, and that strongest moisture convergence and higher RHs ended up being up across North Carolina and resulted in those higher snowfall amounts. So overall, the takeaways and kind of the lessons learned from this, there was sufficient moisture. It wasn't like a dry slot came in and led to those lower amounts in the Midlands. It was just that the forcing ended up going north. So it snowed all day, but we just didn't have enough basically vertical velocity to get anything out of that moisture like they did have in Charlotte that had roughly the same amount of moisture we did. So this overall set up a pretty sensitive and error-prone setup in the models, even though there was very good consensus across all the models showing basically the same thing. It was just an error-prone setup that models we say are under-dispersive, so that the range of things they show can happen is not as big as what can happen in reality. And this was a perfect example of that. And then when you have 15 to 20 to 1 snow ratios, which we did see across the whole area, your margin for error is smaller in the amount of QPF. So in this case, we were forecasting 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch of QPF. We ended up getting a little under that, and that led to a big difference in the snowfall, especially across the Midlands. So in this case, in the future, we would need to potentially forecast maybe slightly wider ranges or message the sensitivity in this type of forecast that, things are going to be kind of dicey depending where you live. And instead of having a forecast of this big swath of 5 to 8 inches of snow, going to have to try to narrow that down somewhere and make a decision on that. So that's overall kind of how we think it went. Went pretty well in some regards, busted a little bit in other areas, but that's meteorology. Doing our best here with what we have and how we go from there. So if you have any questions, let us know.